We come on this loop, John B., my grandfather and me, around Nassau town we did roam, drinking all night, got into a fight.
All right, whenever you're ready.
Okay, I'm ready.
So look more at me.
So it's December 9th, 2014, and I'm here with my son Andrew in beautiful Malibu, California, in the house that my wife Barbara and I own. And several months ago I learned that I had cancer, and this precipitated a gathering in our home here, a wonderful large gathering of sons, girlfriends, cousins, friends, visitors, all swing by to see me and yak. And one evening session with the cousins, and I'll identify them as we go, many questions were asked about what my father, my mother, their grandparents did, my cousin's grandparents did. And I thought it would be fun to share and preserve on a video some of my knowledge of my parents and the family that the kids have not up to this point heard from anyone. And if they have heard, might not get the chance to hear again or remember or pass on down to their kids. So I'm just going to ramble around. I haven't spent a lot of time organizing this. My mother and father, Phil Cassidy Neal, who was named after, whose middle name was the same as his grandmother's maiden name, was
Cassidy or Caldwell?
Caldwell, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
You're right. You're right.
That's okay.
There are Cassidys around. That's my mother's maiden name. Phil Caldwell was born in 1919, just a year after the Great War in Europe ended. And he was a premier student at Oak Park High School in Oak Park, Illinois. He was valedictorian there, I think. I don't know that we have those anymore.
I think we do.
I think we do. I guess it means kind of top dog in your class, or
Yeah.
some kind of award for that. And then he went on to Harvard College. I am collecting some materials to go along with this little talk. One of them is a CD that the American Bar Association created in an interview with Dad about his work in antitrust law over the years, much farther down the road, obviously. And when asked how he got into Harvard, I believe he explains that he didn't have to file a formal application. He just talked to somebody back there, and he went. While he was there, he excelled, getting I believe, a summa cum laude as an undergraduate and a magna cum laude in law school. And then his next move, again, was without the panoply of formal papers and applications and so forth that we think of today. Apparently Bill Jackson, son of Justice Robert Jackson on the United States Supreme Court, told his father about Phil, my dad, and Robert called him up, had an interview, and there he was, clerking for the famous, highly regarded Supreme Court justice who went on to become the prosecutor of the German war crimes trials in Nuremberg, Germany, immediately after the war. Meanwhile, my mother's track was very different. She was the daughter of an Irish plumber in Arlington, Massachusetts. I think she was only first generation, possibly second, I'm not sure. Frank may have been first generation. But her father was Frank Cassidy, he was a plumber. One of her stories about Frank was that he had a shooting gallery in his basement, and while practicing fast draw, shot a hole in his foot. But he was apparently a very kind, wonderful man. My mother always said he would have given anything to see her 4 sons, but he died prematurely while she was, I think, 15
How did he die?
years old. I think he just had a heart attack. Nothing more out of the ordinary than that. Mother's name was Anne Linehan. I think we met Anne Linehan once or twice in the course of a lifetime. Mom and Anne did not get along well. And so that's Mom's parentage. I think probably Anne and Frank were immigrants from Ireland, but I don't have that clearly. So Mother went on to complete high school, and her job out of high school was as the secretary to the law review at Harvard Law School.
Do you know how she got that job?
I don't. I assume she just went in and interviewed the way secretaries do and impressed people with her charm and talent, but that's an interesting question. We'll have to see if anybody knows. But the net of it was that she ended up in the center of this group of highly talented future leaders of America. Cap Weinberger, who was the Secretary of Defense under the Reagan administration, Phil Kurland, who was a distinguished professor of law at the University of Chicago, and numerous others that I can't name. All there courting Mom. She was a sweetheart of the law review, and easy to see why. So when Dad finished law school, they packed off and went to Washington while he served on the Supreme Court. And she served, I think, they called it the WAVES, Women's Auxiliary. It was some kind of a women's military organization. She said something about the Dutch Navy or something. And this gets a little foggy.
And their meeting, how did they meet again?
I think they met because she'd been hired by the law review. And so he met her while she was working in the law review offices. So their next move was they got invited to come west, where Dad was to participate in the United Nations charter creation. And this, Churchill and other leaders had been pressing for some kind of international government that would prevent the recurrence of these wars. And the United Nations, I think, was the idea of Roosevelt, Churchill perhaps. In any event, they set up a convention in San Francisco to draft a charter for it, and Dad became part of that team for however long the project lasted, I think 6 months. One of the little quirks or ironies about that is that the fellow that asked him to take that job was in the State Department and became embroiled thereafter in one of the great scandals of American politics involving communism. His name was Alger Hiss, and it was alleged that he was passing secrets to the Soviets. He had an adversary whose name was, I can't remember at the moment, and there was a great trial about all this. But meanwhile, Dad moved on to private practice briefly in San Francisco for a little firm called Derby, Sharp, Quimby, and Tweed. He likes to tell about that firm as in doing admiralty work in San Francisco, involved in investigations down on the docks and so on, and how Derby, the head guy, would disguise himself as a longshoreman and go hang around down there to try and ferret out evidence. And then he eventually switched to a larger major league firm, if you will, Pillsbury Madison, Sutro, long-term major player in San Francisco law. He worked there for approximately 12 years and then took a job. No, I've got it wrong.
Hold on one second.
Okay.
All right. We were talking about someone at Phil's firm who would pose as a dock worker, a longshoreman.
Yes, this was the firm of Derby, Sharp, Quimby, and Tweed. And Derby, I think, was an actor and liked to get made up in costume and go down to the docks and nose around and find out information about cases he was having. These were admiralty cases where there are injured workers on shipboard and so forth. So that was his thing. And I think Dad initially thought it would be better to work for a small law firm, but rapidly concluded he'd rather move into a bigger operation, which was Pillsbury. And I can't imagine he worked there for more than a couple of years. In 1948, I think it was, he started his career as a law professor at Hastings, a part of the University of California system, Hastings Law School. At the time, I'm not sure exactly what its status was, but by the time I was going to law school in the Bay Area, Hastings was kind of known as a place where senior professors went to kind of cap their career. So that certainly didn't fit Dad. He was right at the beginning. And so he moved on in 1960 to Stanford Law School. And he stayed there for, I got this timing right, he moved to Stanford in 1950, roughly. So I'm 10 years off. And then in 1960 it was that he made the move to the University of Chicago. So he had 10 years as a professor at Stanford Law School, and he had a distinguished cadre of lawyers. The names will be familiar to anyone who follows the news. William Rehnquist, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for a long time, was a student of Dad's, and I think recommended as a candidate for the Supreme Court by Dad. Sandra Day O'Connor was a student of his. I think Anton Scalia was at least an academic colleague of his later at the University of Chicago Law School before he went on the Supreme Court. So Dad had a strong, and one other distinguished student whose name comes to mind was Warren Christopher, who was the Secretary of State during the Jimmy Carter administration. He was the guy that worked so hard and finally succeeded in freeing the American hostages from the Iranians. Christopher was a major figure in Los Angeles. He was basically the senior guy at O'Melveny and Myers, which for many years was a very dominant, top of the line, top of the pile law firm in Los Angeles. So, and then in 1960, Dad was lured back to the University of Chicago, back to Chicago basically. He had not had any academic connection with Chicago, but he was lured to the University Law School by Edward Levy, who he'd known earlier, I'm not sure from where, but was a very distinguished legal scholar. And I think Edward was dean of the law school at the time. Dad was brought in. I think Dad, I don't know whether he knew he was going to soon become dean upon his arrival at Chicago, but in any event, that's what happened. And he succeeded Levy as dean for a period of 12 years. They had, and during those years, my brothers and I lived in Chicago, having been somewhat unhappily uprooted from the warm temperatures of Palo Alto, where we had a nice house up on the hill, Spanish-style house, surrounded by green hillsides of California, at a time when Palo Alto was really quite undeveloped and lush. Our elementary school had something called Kite Day every May. We would trek up to the top of a hill just a mile or two from our house, fly kites, and all of that now, of course, is fully developed. So we went to Sanford Elementary School before we moved to Chicago. In Chicago, we attended the University of Chicago Laboratory School, also known as Lab to those who love it, a very top-end private school associated with the University of Chicago. And we lived down a mile or so north of there on Woodlawn Avenue, I think an avenue name pretty well known to Chicagoans. This was, the university at the time anyway, was in a block of space, maybe 20 by 20 blocks or 40 by 40 blocks, that was carved out of a very deep South Side ghetto and had been turned to sort of gentrification by faculty and related folk. And Father was able to purchase a 3-story meatpacker mansion, we call it, because I think it belonged to one of the Chicago meatpackers before we bought it. It had 10 bathrooms, 10 bedrooms, 6 bathrooms, 6 or more fireplaces, a full basement, the full size of the house, a so-called coach house out behind, which was about the size of an ordinary California subdivision house. I think that had 3 bedrooms. It had a big stall where horses used to be kept. And so it was quite a palace. I think that the annual cost of heating the place was more than the mortgage on it. It was just a vast house, but it was great fun to live in as kids. We had the 4th floor to ourselves. There were basically 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 4 bedrooms, and then a big rumpus room up there. And that's where I almost finished. I think I completely finished my high school years because Mom and Dad moved into a new, smaller house down the street while I was away for my freshman year at Harvard in 1965. So that brings me down to college. Now to back up a little bit, I think I wanted to capture a little bit of what I know, not all that much about my grandparents. I think I've already indicated I know very little about my mother's parents. There's Frank Cassidy, the plumber who shot himself in the foot, and literally, and Anne Linehan, her mother. I know a little bit more about William Neal, my father's father, and Carrie Caldwell Neal, his wife. They came from a large, deep group of southern Neals, Scots-Irish in ethnicity, I think. And in fact, I think the Southeast is full of Scots-Irish. They're a feisty crowd. There's a book by James Webb, who wrote a famous book about Vietnam called Fields of Fire, I think. This other book is called Born Fighting, and it's about the Scots-Irish component of the population in southeastern United States. In any event, William Neal was a traveling salesman for a company called the Atala, A-T-A-L-A, Pipe and Foundry, cast iron pipe and foundry company, something like that. What they made was this soil pipe cast out of, they threw these castings out of sand, poured hot iron into them, and out came the pipe, presto. And I guess my grandfather would spend months of the year on the road, crisscrossing the Midwest, selling this stuff for the company. And not surprisingly, he had developed quite a repertoire of jokes, and was kind of a cordial man who teased his grandkids. He had a salesman's personality, in short. And he also had probably a strong dose of Southern bigotry in him, if it's fair to call it that. My dad might balk at that. But for example, my mother, who was Irish, when brought to the household where my grandfather lived, was, I guess, endlessly twitted about being Irish and shamrocks and so forth. This was far enough back that the age of no Irish need apply was not forgotten. So he teased her a lot about that, which I suppose shows a good side and fun side in him. We never got to know him very well because he died when we were young. I have very dim recollections of Dad going off, seeing Dad off at the San Francisco airport, where when there were only the big 4-propeller planes, no commercial jets yet, so this must have been, had been in the 50s, I guess. So it's regrettable that we didn't get a chance to get to know Grandfather Will better. Carrie Caldwell Neal, Dad's mother, on the other hand, survived into her 90s. She was a tough little lady with a strong Southern accent.
What did you guys call her? Did you call her Nana?
Nana. We called her Nana. You're absolutely right. And she, from time to time, took care of us. She likes to tell stories about those events. One is how when I was 1 or 2 years old, she was taking care of me and I was misbehaving and refusing to do something, and she threatened to spank me. And I said, "Only my mama can spank me," or "Only my daddy can spank me," something like that. She loved to tell that story. I have in the materials I will provide with this monologues some remarks my father made on the occasion of her funeral or service. And she was a good lady. I think she had some strong Confederate connections, but I don't know that I ever laid my hands on any of the paper evidence, but I do recall her saying that she had letters from people who were in the trenches in Vicksburg in 1863, in the days before Vicksburg fell, which was a hard time there and was kind of the turning point of the Civil War.
So what year do you think she must have been born in?
It's a good question. 90 if she died in the 70s or 80s, maybe 1890.
She was at yours and Barbara's wedding.
So that was,
85.
you were correct, and that was 1985 or thereabouts. So I'm thinking she was born in the late 1890s. I don't think she lasted much longer. We have some pictures of her. She bears facially quite a striking resemblance to my father, I think. Others may disagree. So that brings us through the grandparents' generation, I think, on my side, and on my father's side and my mother's side. Dad had 3 siblings. Oldest was William, who was older than Dad. And then his younger siblings were Dick and Josephine. This little sidetrack comes into play because of its later implications. I was known around the family. My Uncle Dick was known as Big Dick. I was known as Little Dick, and my grandmother was so straight-laced that it never would have occurred to her that there was any innuendo involved there. But later on, when your younger brother, Andrew, Ricky, was popping out and putting his face into the world, Barbara, my wife, and Ricky's mother, said that she selected the name Richard, but then we agreed that he would be Ricky, not Dick, so that there would be no more Big Dick and Little Dick in the family. So
Didn't want to hurt Ricky's confidence.
so we have Dick and Ricky. In any event, William Neal, the oldest of the 4, went to war at a fairly young age. I think he must have gone through medical school at the University of Chicago, and then got plunged into World War II. He was in the Navy. He was a surgeon on a destroyer, I think it was called the Wakefield, serving in the Mediterranean during the campaign there against the Nazis. And his ship was torpedoed, and he and a great number of his crew members spent the night in the water before they were rescued. And he was eventually rescued, came back to Southern California. Not sure why he settled here, perhaps because the Navy brought him home after the war to California. Settled in Los Angeles, started up a surgical practice with Kaiser. He believed quite strongly that medicine ought to be available to people of modest means, and Kaiser furnished it on kind of a planned basis. It might be called socialized medicine. And he made a career there from start to finish, never left. I gather eventually grew grumpy with the standards around the place because not everybody had high standards. He retired. I should say, along the way he produced 3 sons with his first wife, Paulita. So I'm going to draw a blank for a second on her last name. But those 3 boys were occasional playmates of ours young men, we would come down here from Northern California for a visit and so forth. And they turned out to be a great trio of guys, Peter and William or Will and John. And interestingly, they are all surgeons. Peter, I think, is a urologic surgeon. Will is a back surgeon,
Orthopedic. Yeah?
orthopedic surgeon, whose home base is in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where I think he lives a pretty good outdoor life. And John, I think, is a brain surgeon back in Wisconsin somewhere, although I'm told he's building a fine house in San Clemente, just down the coast from us here. But so that was William's first generation. He remarried, had a second family, including Emily, Carrie, and David. I think Emily is a librarian somewhere. David is a nurse and a very sweet young man. And Carrie is working in auditory ailments of some kind down here in Southern California. So it looks like almost all of William's children have gone down the path of their father. And by the way, I hope to attach to these materials a brief recap of William's life, which gives some more detail to some of his accomplishments. I believe he was deeply beloved by his patients, and he selflessly went off once a year to some venue in the jungles of Vietnam or South America or the Middle East to serve as a surgeon. This little material bit of writing that I had relates, among other things, that he was in Kabul the night of the Russian invasion. He must have been doing some kind of medical service there. And he was rushed on an emergency basis to the bed of the ambassador to try to save him. He was not successful, but there was William in a hot spot being called on to use his surgical talents to save the ambassador. It's kind of an interesting little sideline. So, let's see, where do we go next?
I'd definitely love at some point for you to go through your young life with whatever you remember from like growing up with Steve coming along, Tim coming along, Andy. Any stories connected to that would be good. Anything we talk over this can just be edited out, so if you want to just think out loud, it's not like we're just going to hit play on this and shovel it through every little bit and every little piece.
Sure, and some of the side talk doesn't hurt either. So I was going to, before moving out of my father's generation of children, mention Uncle Dick, Big Dick.
Big Dick one.
Who also became a doctor, a general practitioner, but who was not fully trained as a doctor by the time the war was underway. So he went off to the South Pacific in the Army as a corpsman or medic. And what he has saved for us is a little personally published memoir about 150 pages long of his experiences in the jungles of the islands out there in the Pacific where the war was fought with the Japanese. And it's very moving. It's firsthand. It's your own relative, and so it's quite meaningful. And the things that stand out to me are first his little incident about the shell landing in his surgical tent and not going off, and how capricious things were, and how close he was at that moment to being blown to smithereens. His his poignant sympathy for all of the lads out there who were dying in those tents, who were 18 years old or 19 years old, had no family, nobody there except the doctors and nurses to kind of hold their hand as they breathed their last. That was pretty powerful. And he also tells about some adventures out in the bush where he and a friend imprudently went off doing something or other and ended up lying low in the weeds while a Japanese patrol or platoon went by for a while. Just very fortunate not to get caught. And then he was in the occupying army when it marched into Tokyo, which must have been a sensation, a powerful sensation, unlike any other that I can think of. The conquering army after that fight and war must have been something. And then, of course, it looked at that point like his war was over and he got to go home. He contracted hepatitis, a very contagious disease, and as a result, he got sealed up in some isolation unit in the ship, all the way back to the west coast. They landed up in the Seattle area in Bremerton, where they whistled him off a boat under guard with nobody allowed. He was the first guy off, and they took him to a hospital and sealed him up there for a matter of, I don't know, weeks or months before he was finally allowed to get out and visit with his relatives. So there's a chapter, Phil and my father and his siblings. I left out Josephine, and I wouldn't want to do that. She was the youngest, very nice lady. I think her premier vocation was as a piano teacher over the years, but very sweet, decent, good woman. We didn't get a chance to know her too well, but well enough over the years. So that's the Phil Neal family chapter with what I remember at the moment.
Okay, you're good.
So we're good?
Yeah.
And we were talking about Josephine.
So if you want to say something like Dad's sister Josephine and then go into it, so then I can start from that point.
Okay, so Dad's sister Josephine was the youngest of the four siblings. A very kind, sweet lady, and I think an accomplished piano player, and I think her principal vocation in life was as a piano teacher. We did not know her well. She lived in the Midwest, and we didn't get much chance to visit with her. She passed on several years ago now, being probably 2011, of pancreatic cancer. So I think that closes out a little bit the loop on my father and his siblings. I want to come back, I think, with some further tales about Dad, and maybe now is as good a time as any to do it. These little anecdotes that I think prompted the idea that it might be fun to do something like this. Let's see, where to begin. He was dean of Chicago from 60 to 72. He then moved into the law firm, which still bears his name. I did not when he joined it, but does now. Friedman and Covenant was known at the time. It's now Neal, Gerber, Eisenberg, a pretty good sized law firm in Chicago. And went on to have, after his career as a law professor, a rather distinguished career as not a trial lawyer, but an appellate lawyer and litigating lawyer. And there are many tales that come out of that era. Dad and Mom were divorced in 1973, I think about the time that he was leaving Chicago. And she moved to, first to Phoenix, where she lived for quite a few years, and then on to Pacific Grove on the coast in California. More of that a little bit later. But he kicked up his heels, romanced the ladies there in Chicago. One story told at his 90th birthday, which we'll get to, by one of his partners, reflected him coming down. He was at a lively dancing party. My brother Andrew, who ended up practicing law with Father for a while, decided Dad needed to go home. He'd had enough partying for the evening. So he took him down to the curb, called a cab, put him in the cab, sent the cab away. Andrew got in the next cab and drove away. And the partner says that within 5 minutes the cab came around the corner, unloaded Dad, who went back to the party.
He was quite a dancer, wasn't he?
He was quite a dancer. And then at his 90th birthday, when he was given a microphone and a chance to speak, he was asked what he most regretted in life. And his answer was that he missed the sexual revolution. This was an interesting comment to his sons, who had always thought of him as a very stern Puritan figure when we were young, and there are some photographs in the collection that indeed, looking at them, would lead you to believe that that is the kind of fellow he was. But he mellowed in his later years, or in any event, he had a lot of fun, and he eventually married one of, I don't know that she was one of his former students, but a former student at the University of Chicago Law School, Linda Linda Thoren, Thoren, and that was about the time that I got married to Barbara, so call it 1985. So they'd been married a long time, had a long, happy run, and they're both still alive and well as we speak. They have a nice country place they go to on weekends down in Michigan around the end of the lake. For a long time, my brother Andy and his wife Holly have had an adjacent place, although they're, I think, in the process of transitioning into a place at another location. But so there is that thumbnail. To take it down now through some of the next generation. What, if anything, did I leave out about? I wanted to tell about Dad a couple of stories, I guess, or at least one, which requires a little bit of circumlocution. My college classmate, Charles Bohlen, B-O-H-L-E-N, not known to me at the time I was in college, was the son of a very well-known and famous American of the World War II era, whose name was also Charles Bohlen, although he had the nickname Chip. And Chip served in various sensitive capacities, including Roosevelt's translator to Stalin. And there's a book worth looking at for any of you who are interested in, called The Wise Men by Walter Isaacson, who also wrote the recent biography of Steve Jobs. And in that book, Isaacson traces the careers of 6 diplomats in the World War II era, including Chip Bohlen, Dean Acheson, Averell Harriman. I can't name the other 3, but these are 6 guys who were at Yale, I think, together in the Skull and Bones, and rose to play huge parts in the Roosevelt administration, the Truman administration, and the I think think perhaps that's about as far as anyone got, but the one of the adventures, several adventures that Chip Bolin had included being somehow on the premises in the building where Ribbentrop and Malakoff signed the Russian Nazi anti-aggression pact that cleared the way for Hitler to invade Western Europe. And then later, somehow, Bolin found himself in a building somewhere in Tokyo. Must have been in the early days of 1942, when Jimmy Doolittle's raiders came over and bombed Tokyo. So that shows Bolin's role in the war. But it turned out that one of my sons, Tim, number 3, who was a student at Polytechnic School in Pasadena, chummed it up with a young Charlie Bolin on the football team there. They were both playing freshman football, I think. And I bumped into Charlie Bolin Sr. at a football game there, who identified himself to me, said we were in the same class at Harvard. Well, it turned out that Timothy and Charlie's daughter, Avis, had a fledgling romance going, which blossomed into 7 years, 3 years at high school, 4 years at college. And so Barbara and I began to see a lot of the Bolins. We've become very close with Charlie and his wife, Jay, and discovered at their home in Glendale, California, on the wall there, a series of knickknacks and photographs, one of them being a 100-ruble note signed by Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill at Yalta, I believe. And then photographs of, I believe, young Charlie sitting in, or maybe Chip Bolin, sitting in the front seat of a convertible with John Kennedy, President John Kennedy, and a picture of Charlie, my contemporary, sitting in the lap of George Marshall, the great George Marshall, who was so important to our victory in World War II. And so I happened to relay all this back to my father, who, without batting an eye, said, "Oh, I've sat in the front seat of a commercial convertible with JFK." Well, it turned out that they were classmates at Harvard, my father and JFK. They were asked by, I believe it was somebody at the freshman union there, to go out and recruit young women to come to dances at the union. And so JFK and my father, Phil, went off, I guess, in the convertible, trying to round up ladies to go to the dances. And they're both handsome lads, so I suspect they had good success. The other twist there is that Father apparently ended up running against JFK for class president of the Harvard class of, I want to say, 1940. And Father defeated Kennedy in that election, and I'm told it's the only election that Kennedy ever lost. That's the myth anyway. So Dad was able to one-up me pretty good on that. What other PCN, Phil C. Neal stories do I have? Doubtless there are some that will come to mind, but let me shift gears and move down a generation, if that makes sense. So Phil, though he was the second son, was the first to start producing offspring, and so I turned out to be the oldest child of the new generation, born in 1947, a little ahead of, I guess, Peter, Uncle William's first son, must have come 2 or 3 years later. And so I grew up in Palo Alto, first in San Francisco. I guess I was born in Mount Zion Hospital in San Francisco. And we lived up there for several years. I'm not sure exactly how long, but eventually moved down to Palo Alto when Dad took up the job at Stanford around 1950, I guess. And soon thereafter along came Brother Steve, 2 years behind me, and Brother Tim, 6 years behind me, and then Andrew, 13 years behind. And we were all living, I should say, Andrew arrived fairly close to the end of our tenure in Palo Alto because we packed up and moved to Chicago when Dad took the job there. And Andrew, I think, thinks of himself as a Chicagoan through and through, having lived most of his life there. So we all marched along our track, and eventually first me and then Steve and then Tim went to Harvard College. After that, I went back to California to go to law school at Berkeley. Steve wasn't far behind, going across the bay at Stanford. Tim set out, first of all, to try to become a Los Angeles policeman, an effort at which he failed, I think based perhaps on the ethnic criteria for hiring in those days. But after some considerable period of time, he gave that up and started working in one small business or another, eventually moved to Phoenix, where he had a long run, and then back to the Bay Area, to the Monterey vicinity, where he spent a good deal of time, and he is now comfortably retired in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, a little touristy town in the Ozarks in the northwestern corner of Arkansas, very pretty, quite quaint. And he seems to be happy as a clown there. He travels, he has enough dough to sustain his modest lifestyle, and he's married third time to a very lovely, nice lady named Lori. And then Andrew elected a totally different path. He married his sweetheart out of law school. Boston University Law School is what I'm talking about. Andrew went to Stanford, went back to BU. I think my brother Steve would say that encouraging Andrew to go to law school was the worst advice he ever gave. Certainly not because Andrew lacks any of the mental acumen or skills it takes to be a good lawyer, but he just, I guess, didn't like the practice, straight and simple. And so he practiced for a while with my dad's firm, and then he set up his own firm, and he eventually gave that up at a point where he and his wife Holly had generated a brood of about 5 children, 4 boys, and finally a girl at the tail end. Holly was very successful and busy as a senior partner at Sidley and Austin, a major Chicago firm. And so Andrew has settled in to become the mom in the family, shuttling kids around, looking after their music lessons and all their needs. And on the side, as a project, kind of taking charge of the fundraising for capital projects at the University of Chicago Lab School, I think playing a very important role, getting that school's new facilities funded and in general providing board level guidance to the school. So he has had a full productive career doing that. Now I double back to Brother Steve, whose career soared from early on. He came back from Stanford Law School to Kirkland and Ellis in Chicago, where he was the darling boy of Hammond Chaffetz, then the godfather of that law firm, and immediately undertook the trial of a major case that normally would not have been handed off to anybody with less than 20 years of experience or something, but Steve was full of confidence. I don't know how or why this occurred, but he talked the folks into letting him try the case, won the case, and it was the beginning of a long string of trial victories. He is a gifted, unusually gifted prodigy of a trial lawyer. Judgment, brains, guts. So he has had a fabulous career as a trial lawyer. He was the lawyer for Charles Keaton and numerous other people in big bad trouble. And he's continuing to practice. At age 65, he has added to his plate the chairmanship of Levi Strauss and also the chairmanship of the Monterey Bay Aquarium. So he's a busy boy, but it all seems to wash off his back like water off a duck. He doesn't get stressed out about it. He has a remarkable Teflon persona, and he is a terrific supporter and advocate for anybody who's got him on their team. Now,
at some point it'd be nice to hear details that, because one of the things that's nice about listening to all these stories that are well beyond our generation's time is the fact that none of us know these stories. So for example, talking about things you remember from being a kid in your house, things you used to do with Steve, or a memory you have of Steve as a kid and Tim as a kid and Andy as a kid, like those kinds of things are things that we have no contact with, and we only know you guys in your roles as our fathers and uncles and stuff. So those kinds of details are, like, in my opinion, things that we'd love to have.
Good to have. Well,
and if you want to take a break, we can start this up again whenever you want to.
Well, while you're on that topic, I can throw out a few of those.
Okay, let's do that.
I don't know them all, but one famous Dick Steve story concerns a new wading pool that I'd been given for my birthday or something. And we're out in the yard. Steve had a kitchen knife or something, and I dared him to cut a hole in the bottom of the swimming pool. And
how old were you?
I don't know, we were 5, 7, something like that, not very old. And not surprisingly, he took the dare, dummy, and got in trouble with Dad about it. I was not punished for it, even though I had dared. And I thought quite properly the criminal act was blamed on the perpetrator, not on someone who just made a little dare that I didn't really mean. Steve and I have had ongoing byplay about that.
What about memories of Phil as a dad? Let's say Thanksgiving dinner, or discipline for some sort of misbehavior at school. Mamie as a mom when you were younger.
Phil was one of those guys who I thought, or looking back, had the stern moral authority that he hardly needed to say anything to be obeyed. I don't think if he spanked me more than once or twice in my youth, that would be the max. There was an issue, we kids were out pooping in the hills. I thought it was cool to go out and take a dump in the deep grass. I mean, our house, I remember my first visit to the site of our Los Altos house. It was on a hilltop above where the Foothill College now stands. And it was in the season when there was deep green grass, it was muddy. I was frightened that the car was not going to get out of there. It was stuck, the wheels were spinning. But in any event, the hills were just covered with green, and then they developed these crops of deep yellow mustard, and we'd crawl and tunnel through the mustard. And occasionally we take a dump somewhere out in there. And Dad got wind of that and was very stern with me about it. And sort of made me show him how I did it, I think. I can't remember, I don't think he even spanked me. I don't think he had to. He just, you know, that's what he said and that was it. I don't remember any other disciplinary episodes. He just had an authority about him. And indeed, far up into my college and law school years, I think I was in awe of him. And it was far along into my adult working life when I got to the point where we'd have a one-to-one conversation on an equal basis, not because of anything he did. He was very smart, and he didn't ramp it down to talk to his kids. I mean, on the other hand, I note, and I hope to include in the accompanying materials, a collection of letters sent to his law firm probably 10 or 15 years ago, 10 years ago maybe, on the occasion of a celebration of his life at the firm, in which they had solicited notes from lawyers all over the country about their experience with him as a professor. And of course there were notes among these from the very best and brightest and most successful, the O'Connors and the chief that I mentioned, why am I forgetting his name? Rehnquist and others. But there were also a large number of notes from Joe Smith in Podunk, Oregon or somewhere, who'd been a student of his, clearly bottom of the class kind of student, thanking Dad for something he'd done along the way to help them along the way on their career. There was a young woman in the class back when there were hardly any women who had tried to get a job. She was looking to settle in Carolina, north or south, I've forgotten which. And she went in and saw Dad. Dad apparently picked up the phone. He had some contact down there. And before he was through, he had got a job for her down in Carolina. And it kind of runs through these materials that he was very kind and helpful and a mentor, true mentor to his students, even though he was intellectually pretty tough.
Switching over to Mamie, just things you remember about being at home, Chris, things she used to cook, funny things she used to say or do, things you guys used to make fun of her for, whatever comes to mind. And if I do something like this, it means the battery's about to die.
Okay.
I don't want to speak over you in case you're in the middle of saying something.
So Mamie was the name my mother kind of acquired somewhere along the way. I guess maybe when the first grandchildren arrived, she was not Mamie until then. Always Mary. And she was much beloved among all of us. One of the memories I have is that when I was 16, I set out with two other high school buddies to hike the John Muir Trail in California. And at the time, the gear available for backpackers was very limited. To find a good backpack for the purpose was very hard. Mom helped me kind of find the materials, a frame, stitch together and make a frame, get totally outfitted for that trip. It was like she was sort of in on the fun of the project, helping me put that together. She had a great sense of humor. Whatever temper she had, and I think she had one at a certain level of heat was generally kept totally in line. She was a huge favorite among the law students at both Stanford and Chicago. I particularly remember in Chicago, where I was old enough to be around the parties and occasionally do some bartending, that Mom was just a favorite of theirs, always encouraging and helping. And she had her two buddies on the block there, Kate Levy and Gene Meltzer. Levy and Meltzer were two professors at the university. I mentioned Levy, he was the dean before Dad. Meltzer was a very smart, distinguished professor at the law school. And in fact, our families lived next to each other. And most every morning, when the weather was bad, Levy or Meltzer or Dad would drive the Neal boys and the Meltzer and Levy kids down the street to the lab school, which was about a mile away and a pretty crisp walk on a 10-degree day. So Mom would hang out with Kate and Gene. The houses were adjacent, back doors. Want an egg, go over, borrow an egg. They had a nice relationship. Mom had the same relationship before when we lived in Palo Alto. The dean of it was up on the hill behind Palo Alto, actually, in the Stanford Hills, and the dean of the law school's house was kitty corner to ours, and there was kind of a hole in the fence, so you could walk up through there. And the dean's wife was Sheila Spade, a wonderful Scottish lady, and Mom was always popping back and forth through that hole to see Sheila, get something from her, or get something for her.
What were the staples of the Mary Neal kitchen in terms of things you remember eating as a kid?
I can remember some of this, and in fact, I should add to the stack of supplemental materials what she fashioned the Jewish Mother's Cookbook, which she and Kate Meltzer and Gene Levy assembled. It was in handwritten form for a long time, and at some point years ago I transcribed it into typed form. It's around somewhere, and it had what I think you modern day chefs would regard as pretty simplistic recipes. There was creamed tuna,
Beef stroganoff,
simple recipe, and then a whole bunch of simple recipes for things like how to make a casserole of rice, how to do a roast, how to do a hollandaise. Her hollandaise recipe stands the test through today. But it was all designed to be stuff that kids at college who didn't have much cooking skill could do. And I think it was pretty typical. I'm trying to remember dinner in our the back kitchen in our big old house on Woodlawn Avenue. It was very often creamed tuna, where she would lay chicken breasts on a bed of rice, bake that in a casserole. Now I think her cooking skills were better than that overall, but that was kind of the working days cooking. And it was just fine.
What was the atmosphere like at the dinner table when the four of you were old enough to...
I think it was pretty good. I don't have a strong recollection of it, but we always did sit down to dinner. Mom would make a big salad with a vinegar and oil dressing. Always a good mix. It was a very tasty dressing. And I was always, before dinner, trying to sneak by and pinch a piece. And Dad was always whacking my hand. No, wait till dinner. His other dinner time trick was that I would rock my chair. Maybe the other guys rocked their chair. We had these hickory upholstered chairs with four rather thin legs and a back, and maybe some prospect that rocking on them would do harm to them. I don't know, but we're always rocking back on the chairs. That was a no-no.
What about competition between the brothers? At what age was that? Did that start happening, and what did it look like?
I don't remember that being a big deal. You know, I can have the most distant recollection of a fist fight or two with Steve or Tim, but very rare. One or two maybe, and I can't remember what the occasion was.
Is it true that Tim once chased Steve around the house with a butcher knife?
That is a takeoff on a story about Nancy Packard, who was a Birmingham, Alabama gal with red hair and a hot temper who chased her brother around the block with a butcher knife. I don't think Tim chased Steve around the block with a butcher knife or the house, but I do recall one event. Can't remember what touched him off, but we had a 3-story house. I remember Tim flying up the stairs in a rage and whanging that door shut so hard that the whole house shook. And that's what I recall on that theme.
Did Phil become softer as each boy came along? Was he less of a disciplinarian with Steve and then Tim and then Andy, or was it pretty consistent?
So. I think so. I think it happens with most parents. And like I say, he was never put to the necessity of being a real strict disciplinarian, because he had an imposing moral authority over all of us. Now, he was also a pretty gutsy man, which I saw displayed one night. I came walking home down Woodlawn Avenue. It was probably a cold, gray evening, and 2 houses down from us was the house of Elijah Muhammad, the prophet of black Muslims. And there were some kids out front who kind of pushed us around as we went by. My dad, in his suit and his tie, marched us back out there and just dressed the shit out of these guys. And without the slightest hint of fear. I guess it was sort of his adult status or something, but he wasn't about to let that go unremarked on.
You had some other famous neighbors in that neighborhood.
We did. Down the street on the, well, first of all, across the street lived the son and wife of Joe Louis, the boxing great, a world champion heavyweight boxer at some point. Joey was a little guy, very friendly. I remember fooling around with him. One thing I remember doing with him is taking apples, coring them out, stuffing a firecracker in the center, lighting the firecracker, and throwing it out over some neighbor's house.
And what would Phil have done if he had caught you doing that?
I don't have a clue. Don't have a clue.
All right, one thing that'll make this part a little bit more helpful, and this is just pure function of like a production function. If I ask you a question, repeat the question in your answer. So if I say, like, for example, was there any competition between you and Steve? Use that in your answer so that I can cut it without my voice. So I can just have you saying, there wasn't much competition between Steve and I, and then it's like a full package rather than reliant, because my voice is going to sound weird coming from behind. It still might be usable, but that's just something that makes it so that each little snippet fits together as well. All right, so what about Christmas time? What did Christmas time used to look like?
What did Christmas time used to look like? We liked Christmas a lot. It was warmly and eagerly celebrated in the house. We decorated up. We had trees. We had lights on the tree. We had lots of ornaments. We eagerly awaited the arrival of our presents, and I think just generally very much enjoyed the season.
Did you ever travel anywhere to visit family Christmas?
I'm trying to remember. Seems to me like we might have driven down to Birmingham to visit the southern relatives for our Christmas once. We might have visited Uncle William. But I don't have any clear memories of that.
All right, how about this? Finish this sentence. The most trouble I was ever in with my parents was when? Or the most afraid I was of seeing my parents was when I... For example, my example was the time that you guys went for a week and I went to the Dodger game and I tried to squeeze the car, the big Suburban, into this tiny... There are 50 spaces past the next car, and I just decided to do this big turn and just fuck the side of the car, and I remember just dreading you guys coming back and seeing that and just being shit scared. So what would you say was the most...
Well, maybe mine is a similar incident where I had a newly acquired driver's license. I was down in a parking lot at 53rd Street in Woodlawn buying something at the drugstore or something. This car was a Plymouth Suburban, which was a brown square job with these bumpers about the size of a basketball. And I managed to back out of there right into the door of some guy's car, leaving a hole big enough, actually a dent, almost big enough to shove a basketball into. So I was pretty terrified that the old man would be really pissed off, and he instead was totally understanding, sort of seeming to know that this wasn't the time to jump all over my ass. Other than that, I was such a goody two-shoes as the #1 kid, and sufficiently in awe, I guess. Steve was much more liberal about his shenanigans, and he didn't seem to get in much trouble for it.
Do you remember any specific shenanigans?
Well, and specifically, I remember that when the parents were out of town for some weekend, he had a girl in overnight. I won't say her name. And I'm sure it had some booze in there, so there were 2 offenses. Not sure which would have been viewed as the more serious. But that's one I remember. I don't think any of us ever got in trouble with the law. We did have some fairly wild adventures as kids. One of them was driving from Chicago to the West Coast with 2 contemporaries from high school who lived around the corner, and had one of these VW microbuses, you know, the orange, and which they were given to transport us out to the coast where we were going to do Sierra Club trips. And we got all the way out to west of Salt Lake City in the Great Salt Flats out there, and threw a rod and just broke down. It was hotter than hell. And so I think Steve and I each bailed out and hitchhiked back to somewhere, maybe back to the airport. Steve, I know, hitchhiked back to the airport in Salt Lake. Not sure what I did. But I did a fair amount of long distance hitchhiking in the West, which I'm not sure people do anymore. You know, from central Idaho down to the east side of the Sierra in California, and in the east too, which was always kind of an adventure. Probably safer back then. I don't know.
What was the first summer that you left home to do rangering or to be gone from the nest? And repeat that again. So the first summer I was gone.
Well, the first summer I didn't stay at home would have been, 60, at least as early as 68. Probably earlier than that, because 63 was the summer that Arnon and that I met Arnon on a Sierra Club trip. And it was the same summer that Peter Hildebrand and Danny Teitelbaum and I walked into the Sierra Club work trip, worked there for 10 days, and then turned north and walked up to the north terminus of the John Muir Trail. We'd taken enough food in. That trip was an adventure because it was early, there was snow over huge portions of the trail, and we had to pick our way over passes. We had no GPS, we had a set of maps, and we eventually learned to read them. We didn't get too badly lost. And we were carrying these huge heavy packs with a full-size grill, if you can believe it, eating Spam and pancakes and but
what initially piqued your interest in backpacking? Because backpacking has been a huge part of your life. How did that get started? When did the interest develop? And repeat that again. So the interest in backpacking.
My interest in backpacking and the outdoors, I think indirectly at least, I owed a dad. He had at Stanford Law School a student whose name was Philip Berry, who died recently, who graduated from Stanford Law School, one of Dad's students, and went on for some substantial period to be the director or head of the Sierra Club. And I think it was probably the summer of '61, Dad arranged to have us go, me and a school contemporary of mine, on a trip that Phil Berry was leading up in the Three Sisters Wilderness in Oregon. It was not a backpack trip, but it was a horseback trip where the horses carried most of the gear. And so that I was hooked after that. The next summer, I think we did a Sierra Club backpack trip. That was '62, and then '63 was the summer that we did the Muir Trail trip. And then pretty much after that, every summer I was.
Tell a little bit about what you think it was that hooked you, starting with what hooked me about it. Can you remember those moments?
Well, I think what hooked me about it was that I was just enchanted with the scenery, the smells, the cold stream water on the face, the sense of being up on top of mountains and passes I loved, and the exercise. I was, throughout all this, a track team member, so I was running half miles and half miles, and so that kind of fit in with miles and half miles, so that kind of fit in with the activity. And that's probably the nub of it.
Wait one sec.